in the White House. Good morning, Karen Travers.
Good morning. Where would you like to start today? We've got a lot of headlines.
Yeah, let's start with what happened yesterday. Sean Spicer came out and tried to explain the timeline of what the White House knew, when they knew, and why they decided to let Michael Flynn go yesterday.
Yeah, so January 26th is when the Department of Justice first reached out to the White House to say that they had concerns that based on what Mike Flynn was saying publicly and what they knew from surveillance of the Russian ambassador, that there was a discrepancy between the public story and the background story. And they said that that made them concerned about the potential vulnerability for blackmail of Mike Flynn. So that was January 26th. It took more than 2 weeks then for the president to ask Mike Flynn for his resignation. And I went through the timeline. During that period, Mike Flynn sat in the Oval Office for the president's phone call with Vladimir Putin. He came out to the briefing room and declared Iran was put on notice. And he was there over the weekend in Mar-a-Lago when the president and Japanese prime minister were huddling about North Korea's ballistic missile launch. That's all not surprising. He's the national security advisor. He's supposed to be there for those things. But then when you learn that there's this cloud of question and that the White House during that whole time knew that he might be susceptible to blackmail, it just kind of paints everything in a different picture.
Also, Karen Travers, the White House, from what I understand, is saying that they are not they don't think Mike Flynn did anything wrong,
right,
but they can't trust him. Well, they knew they couldn't trust him weeks ago when the Justice Department tipped him off. So why the 13, 14 days that they knew he was lying, quote unquote, but didn't want to do anything about it?
The White House wouldn't answer that directly. They just kept referring to this eroding and evolving level of trust between the president. So, he trusted him on January 26th, and then he hears all of this, and then over those 17 days. Now, the question is, if Mike Flynn had just been upfront the whole time about it and said, yeah, I talked about sanctions, would this even be an issue at this point? It's that there was the discrepancy between what actually happened on the call and what the Department of Justice heard. Also, just want to note, the whole thing was because of what Mike Flynn said to Mike Pence, who then went on television and said, no, he didn't talk about sanctions. Mike Pence wasn't told about that Justice Department warning until he heard about it through media reports last week. He wasn't in the loop when senior staff was huddling about this in late January.
I'm confused. You're national security guy, and you're about to be sworn in. Why wouldn't you talk to Russia about sanctions? Why was it such a secret? It seems like that would be a normal part of a conversation when you're coming in.
Well, you can't actually. When you're a private citizen, there's a thing called the Logan Act that says you can, as a private U.S. citizen, engage in diplomacy that just prevents, freelancing and all sorts of chaos. There's also just a diplomatic breach of protocol, potentially. Again, not surprising that he was talking with his counterpart or the Russian ambassador, but if there was assurances of these sanctions are coming, these sanctions are going to be in place, but we'll do it differently, or here's how we might approach this. That's where things get a little murky. But I should point out that the investigation right now, there's an FBI investigation into these conversations. And for now, there's no evidence of any criminal wrongdoing of Mike Flynn. That's reported. We were told that by multiple government sources. But, we do know that he sat down with the FBI and did an interview before the Justice Department went to the White House and said, we're a little worried about this because of this Russian blackmail factor. So the question is going to be, what did Mike Flynn tell to the FBI during that interview?
All right, Karen Travers. And then you had overnight the New York Times post a story saying that now, and you tell us what it said, but basically confirming many different sources that the Trump campaign had numerous contacts with Russian authorities. What's this about?
Repeated and frequent contacts between Trump campaign officials and Russian intelligence officials. And U.S. authorities were concerned about this and were looking into it. Now, what's not in the piece is what the conversations were about, what was actually discussed. They came to light during the investigation into the DNC hacking, but the New York Times piece says that there's no evidence that there was any cooperation between Team Trump and Russia on the hack. That's an important fact. But it's also worth noting that yesterday, my colleague John Carl asked the White House specifically, can you say that nobody in the Trump campaign, not even General Flynn or anybody, had contact with the Russians before the election? in light, of course, of General Flynn's conversation. And the White House said there's nothing that would conclude them to say anything different. No, there were no conversations. President-elect Trump in January said the same thing. And now this report, and we're told by multiple sources that, there were contacts.
Karen Travers, you're there at the White House every day. What's the mood like? What's going on? What's not being said? It seems like you have to keep your head on a swivel in that room.
Yeah, there's certainly a headline coming every hour. And I think an important thing, too, compared to previous administrations. I was here for several years of the Obama and several years of the Bush administration. And the ability of the president to make his own news, he doesn't have to come to the briefing room. He doesn't have to go and do an interview. He has tweeted 3 times in the last hour, and he's blasting this New York Times report, saying it's nonsense and it's an attempt to cover up the mistakes made by Hillary Clinton's losing campaign. And he's also blasting the leaks, which he say are illegal leaks from the intelligence community. So that's different, and that certainly means that you just can't not pay attention for a second, because the president could come out and do that.
Yeah. The other thing, too, though, is he has a point, because in intelligence leaking information, that is very illegal, dangerous, and a bad precedent to be setting.
Yeah, the president's last tweet, information that he says is being illegally given to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and he blames the intelligence community for this, and then he finishes it off by saying, just like Russia.
Karen Travers, ABC News correspondent at the White House. I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you.
All right, 628, Big 550, KTRS. I will say this, though. He is the same candidate who said, I love WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is great. Don't you remember WikiLeaks? He also went on to say that if Russia is listening, can you find Hillary's 30,000 emails? Why don't you hack into those and tell us what those are? So he certainly benefited from illegal hacks. And Marco Rubio was the only one who stood up who said, this is bad, because at some point they're going to start leaking our stuff. And I'm not going to use their stuff, because they might start using our stuff, and we need to take a stand. Not too many other people were as principled as Marco Rubio at the time. But if you're complaining about leaks now, were you complaining about leaks then, and or vice versa? So we're in a dangerous time in terms of information and who's telling what and so on and so forth. But when you have rogue FBI and justice people leaking classified information to the news media, that's bad. I don't care who's in office. 629, Big 550.